Tuesday afternoon, 4 p.m. in Central Europe, and it's Space Café Web Talk time. Our Space Café Web Talk, 33 minutes with Dr. Andreas Wittmer about what can space regulation learn from the aviation sector, live from St. Gallen, will begin soon. As always, we appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback. SpaceWatch.Global is a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and the new space activities in a geopolitical context. I would like to thank all of our private and corporate supporters that showed their commitment to keeping our independent journalism alive. We really appreciate that. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, the bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. The last one, our 50th episode, featured Professor Hans-Jörg Dittus on lacking European visions for space today. Just give it a listen. For all of our fans of audio content, we have new episodes in the Space Café radio. We also keep our fan shop open online for you to support us actively and become a space watcher. If you have missed any of our previous episodes, we have an archive available on our website in the events section or on YouTube. Today, I'm in St. Gallen to talk with one of the creators and masterminds behind the Space for Business program. But I will talk with him about the potential learnings from the aviation industry. With that, a very warm welcome, Dr. Andreas Wittmer.
Thank you.
To introduce you to our audience, Andreas is the program director for the Space for Business program at the University of St. Gallen, as you could assume that. He holds great teaching positions at Swiss and international universities on Bachelor, Master's and executive level. His research focuses on network industries such as aviation. His interests link with a better understanding of efficiencies generated by networks and the impacts on stakeholders. He regularly publishes in international journals and books and is a member of several editorial journals and conference boards. Furthermore, he is vice president of the Swiss Aerospace Cluster, vice president of the Swiss Aviation Research Center, and a freelance aircraft accident investigator at the Swiss Aircraft Accident Investigation Office. He holds awards for best teaching at Modul University Vienna, best paper awards from AIEST Conferences and Honours from FIA and Pro Aero Foundation for excellent works with a center, and that's what he heads, for aviation competence at the University of St. Gallen. Super impressive. Andreas, welcome again. And a full disclaimer, I have the honor to be involved in the Space for Business program as a lecturer. So, let's kick that off. If we want to talk about aviation and space regulations, maybe you can give us a short historic overview of how regulation started in aviation, and because I assume it's a gradual process as well, so it's not happened overnight.
Well, you're right, Torsten. I think in the early days, like in the 40s, in the end of the Second World War, we had the first kind of global regulations coming up. The Chicago Convention, the Ikea was founded, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, and this organization is providing recommendations for the aviation industry on a global scale. It was very important to have global rules with respect to aviation, because aviation is global, and in every country you should have the same rules for pilots, for planes, for airports. And so there were some agreements made then. Some agreements which were very important for international air transport were the 9 freedoms of the air, which allowed or defined under what conditions airlines can fly to other countries and carry freights and passengers. So this moved on. Basically, the airline industry was a state's airline industry. It was the states that owned airlines, that created airlines, that also built airports. And this moved and developed over the years until the 70s. In the 70s, a first liberalization activity happened in the United States in 1978. The US market was liberalized. So basically, the airlines were privatized, and a free market economy in the aviation industry was created. This led, of course, to more dynamics in the market and also new business models, like suddenly low-cost carriers, which are very different than kind of state-owned network airlines appeared on the market. So innovation was created. In Europe, in the early 90s, the same happened. We liberalized in Europe the market, and new airlines like Ryanair appeared. The whole market changed. The prices went down. Suddenly, aviation and to fly around was affordable for everyone. We democratized air transport, and with this democratization on a global scale and the further liberalization in Asia, more and more people were traveling. So the customer kind of group of airlines grew significantly. And with this, we saw a lot of growth in the industry, average about 5% growth a year on a global scale over decades. And this, of course, led to more and more planes and more development and more innovation in the market, which is all great, but it also led to negative effects. And that's what we talk about today very much in nowadays time, that we basically contribute to the environment in a negative way with this industry. And we haven't done much about it. I mean, so far, organizations just economically grew and earned money. And now suddenly we realize, hey, there are external costs and we have to deal with those. And that challenges the industry nowadays very much. And I think from this historic development of liberalization to the challenges of today, other industries can learn as well.
A simple question, for my understanding, where does space start and where ends the aviation authority?
Well, I think it's a very good question you're raising. I mean, aviation is very much about the transport of people and freight, but very much people. It's people's transport. It's up to a level of about 13,000 meters. It's within the atmosphere, right? I mean, we are not going to the same levels as space. So somewhere in an altitude of about, let's say, at most 14,000 meters, it's finished with aviation. And I think what is above is what I would perceive as space. We could argue that when we look at, for example, the measurements of what meteorologists do and which is needed by aviation very much, that goes higher up, right? We go up to maybe 30,000 meters, which has a very big impact on routing and the operation of aviation. So you could argue that there is a strong link to aviation, but is it really aviation? I doubt it. I think for me, aviation is the transport of goods and services to an altitude of about 14,000 meters max.
But that's the civil aviation.
Yes.
So, I mean, militaries fly obviously higher, but I mean, at one stage the air becomes so thin that obviously wings does not carry you anymore. So, and beside rockets or nuclear ICBMs, that fly into space and then coming back for the purpose. What else can fly there? I mean, I think U2 is still not disclosed what maximum altitude it had.
Well, I mean, you're right with military and drones as well, and also, I mean, we have in the business aviation certain business jet supersonic planes that are developed. We had Concorde, right, which can go on higher altitudes, right, which is true. So we have some activities that go to higher altitudes. Okay. But I guess that in these higher altitudes, I think aviation meets space in a certain extent. And most commonly in commercial aviation, including business aviation, there is not that much activity higher up.
Interesting. I mean,
sorry to add, you could argue that when you talk about space tourism, for example, where you go to kind of a mid-level, not really high, but to a certain level, you could argue, is it aviation or is it space? That's something which is kind of connecting aviation and space, which I find personally very, very interesting, right? So you could say, okay, some of these planes start like planes, kind of, or are, if you look at Virgin Galactic, they're flown up in a normal way up to 14,000, 15,000 meters, and then they move a bit onto the edge of space and experience that feeling, and then they fly down again, which is very close to aviation. It's kind of at the edge of what aviation can do and where space starts, which,
I think in my opinion, the fundamental question that has to be asked is, aviation is regulated by the territories under there, and space is for everyone. So, and that is one of the discussions where Kármán line is or where it's not, and it's accepted by all countries, because then in space I can fly over a country, so to say, wherever I want. So, and I'm quite sure that it's regulated, and we will talk about it in a moment. You talked about the IKEA, not IKEA, IKEO, not IKEA. IKEA is the other one. ICAO. Is that a UN organization, and does it operates on consensus? And how was that possible to get this consensus?
Yes, I mean, it is a UN organization. It works on consensus, and it is, you have countries that you can be member country of ICAO, and then there is every 3 years a General Assembly where the country representatives, usually the Ministry of Transport representatives or Aviation Department of the Ministry of Transport representatives meet and discuss strategies, developments for the future. And then it's about consensus, and it's about signing protocols. And what, for example, was very interesting in 2017 it was, at the assembly, we had a protocol signed concerning climate change, concerning the impact of aviation on climate. The CORSIA, this kind of emission trade scheme, was signed. And interesting was, it was signed by the big countries. I mean, by also all the big countries, meaning China, India, meaning US, which are all countries that haven't signed such protocols before. So they found a consensus for aviation to reduce the negative impact until 2050, which is a step. So this organization has an impact, is important, because aviation is global and not regional. The problem we have in this industry is that we have regional policies or national policies, but a global impact. So if we decide on a national level, then we will always decide on issues like noise, like smell, like the local economy, but we don't decide on the basis of what the global impact is, or only in a second kind of stage. And ICAO is really taking that global approach, and for this reason, for the industry, is very important.
So how many countries are in ICAO? Is it all countries? Or I think most countries with airplanes then, obviously. Otherwise they couldn't travel from A to B.
I can't give you the number. I don't know the number exactly. I know that not every country in the world is member.
Interesting.
Right? Not every country in the world is member, but the countries that operate commercial air transport, I mean, whether they are member or not, if they're not compliant with kind of the basics of ICAO recommendations, you cannot operate, right? If your runways are not big enough, if your pilots don't have that license you need, if you will not be able to operate internationally. So the recommendations they do are usually put into or adapted for national legislation, put into national law, or in Europe, for example, we have EASA, and EASA is creating the regulation which we use, including Switzerland, for aviation. So that's ICAO, that flows into EASA. EASA maybe is a bit stronger on some issues, right? Okay. Adds on, and then it comes to Switzerland or to Germany or to Austria, and then the Swiss government puts it into national legislation again and can add. I mean, in Switzerland we have a lot of mountains, so we may have some safety issues in some airports which makes us regulate some additional rules or make some additional rules. But generally, ICAO flows into these legislations, okay, and then they go into national legislation, and then we have to act accordingly.
I think we talked so far about primarily civil aviation, humans in space. So thinking about drones, UAVs, how is the process today that at ICAO for adapting new roles? So how is this changing process? Because drones haven't been there 20 years ago.
Yes, that's a hot topic actually. I mean, we don't only have this topic, let's say on a global scale, we have it at the EASA level, we have it in Switzerland, so there is a lot of questions how to operate drones, how to regulate drones, are you regulating drones under the aviation regulation or not? ICAO, I mean, this is a process. I'm not aware of final regulations. I know that in this country we have a discussion of whether, let's say, drones are kind of model planes, or whether they are not, and when they are, how long are they counted as model planes and for hobby purposes to fly around for fun, and when are they kind of commercial, and that makes a difference. So we have to figure out how to put these regulations, in this case here in Switzerland, which we have from European level, I mean EASA, into local regulations, so we may not kill kind of hobbies of individuals. That's a big discussion. Like you go to the mountains and you have your glider plane and you fly around. You could call it a drone, right?
Yeah.
What is a drone? It's not a drone, and this challenges us quite a bit.
Interesting.
But I'm not aware of the implementation or agreement or final agreement of drones on the civil level. I'm not a specialist on military level, because military drones have been around for way longer. Right.
Absolutely,
and, that's a different kind of regulation, kind of independent from civil aviation.
That would be my next question. So how is military aviation involved? Are they applying to the same rules, or simply not?
I speculate a bit. I mean, generally, military regulation are different. They have their own regulatory system. They are organized not in the civil aviation. It's also not the Federal Office of Civil Aviation that is responsible. They have their own kind of military organizations that are responsible. But I honestly have to speculate, or I'm not entirely sure with the drones, because this is still quite new, if there are any overlaps, for sure I expect these military and civil aviation offices to talk, right? That's also what to do in aviation. I mean, you have to talk. If you have military planes up here and you have commercial airplanes up here and you have one airspace, you have to talk, right? You have to separate. You have to deal with it. So, of course, there is interaction, but it's not the entirely same law or same regulation.
I see. I think when we talk about peace times, it's a different topic than when we talk about war times. And I assume that, like on the traffic on the street, that military vehicles have to behave like any other vehicles while driving.
You made an important point about war times and non-war times. I mean, the reason why we have the sky, I mean, the countries, the nationalities keep the sky under their kind of own kind of responsibility is exactly this. You want to keep the airspace in your responsibility. In Europe, we talk about a single European sky in air transport. It would reduce the negative impact by 10 to 20%, but we cannot agree, and it has been on the table for almost 20 years. We cannot agree on that. We cannot agree on saving all these emissions and have more direct flights because of the security concerns we have, and the countries that want to be really in charge of their airspace on top of a country. So that's the military side, right? As you say.
National borders end somewhere. So who owns or who's in charge of a plane, a drone, when it's over an ocean, a free ocean, on no man's land? I mean, we have these areas, and maybe because we are leading into the topic of what we can learn in the space sector. So how is it dealt on that place?
Well, the ownership of the plane is with the operator.
Okay.
Right, the operator. Okay. So if you have a Lufthansa plane flying over the ocean to the US, I mean, the operator owns the plane and is responsible for operating the plane. But if you look at, for example, airspace control, if you look at what is actually controlled and what isn't, then yes, you have areas over the oceans, maybe even over Central Africa, where you're not controlled, where planes are in contact with each other, but not necessarily with the ground station.
Interesting.
So there is some uncontrolled areas, and a good example was when we had the accident of the Air France plane Airbus in Brazil, maybe 10 years ago or something like that. Took a year to find it, right? Because it was in that area where it was not connected to any kind of airspace control and meant into trouble there, right? So do you have areas that are not controlled on the planet?
I mean, I apologize for all these very simple entry-level questions for you, I'm quite sure, but I would like to make the connection to the space regulation. What would you say, given the current status of space regulation, what can space learn from the aviation sector?
I think aviation, if you look at aviation history, referring back to my initial statements here, it is a great development of growth. I mean, you have a growth industry over decades. We have, connected the globe. We created tourism. We created mobility. We created a global economy. You have so many great results that came out of that global air transport. So it's so important. But then we learned in the last 10, 15 years, very, very specifically, and in the last 5 years explicitly, that it's not sustainable. This growth and this development is not sustainable. And my question would be for space to think about how to maybe self-regulate or create policies so the industry is not ending up where aviation ended up. I mean, everyone is just hammering on aviation, blaming aviation. Well, it's 2-3% of global CO2 emission, but still, if you listen to the media, if you think of Greta and her impact, aviation is really has been pushed into the corner of the bad guy, right? And the question is, what do we have to do, and how should we do so we are not ending up there with space in 20 years from now, right? And there are some signs that are alerting. I mean, if you look at how much flies around this planet, which is not even operational anymore. Yeah. If you look at waste, I don't know even what it means if we launch on a daily basis kind of rockets. Some private operators that do that very much. What is actually the impact? And at the moment, nobody knows. But there will come a time when the society thinks about that, and then you have the society, politics, the regulator, coming back, regulating a rather free market. And the question is, do we want to regulate ourselves by giving us in the market policies ourselves, self-regulate, to be smart, sustainable, or do we just kind of waste the space and then get the hammer in the end and have to go back, right? And that's the big question. And I think we can learn from aviation because aviation just overdeveloped. There were some developments which were just not sustainable in this industry, and we have to learn the hard way to come back somehow and think about also as users what is right and what is wrong. What can we afford to do from an environment perspective? What can we not afford to do? And I think we should think in this direction in space and learn from aviation.
I mean, I know from our coverage that number of these issues you mentioned already are at least on the radar of scientists. I mean, we see that with climate change. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, scientists were warning about it, and now we have the effects. Now we are in this process as governments try to react. I mean, we see it with space debris slowly moving, but what you mentioned with the impact on the ozone layer by rocket launches, there were studies from NASA, they were public as well, but I mean, yeah, Elon is trying to get, I think, up to 3 rocket launches a day, and I would consider it as scary as well. Space traffic management is one of the hot issues in Europe, in the European Commission, also in many countries. So what could be a theoretical approach or theoretical method from the aviation sector that can apply it to regulate this traffic in space?
Yeah, I mean, if you have more and more traffic in space, you may get to the point where you have to manage it. Otherwise, you run the risk of having accidents, and that can be disastrous. So what can we learn? I mean, I think in air transport, it was kind of a nation-based approach. Every nation started to put its airspace into certain areas which were managed, and you gave some altitudes for certain areas, and just, you put it kind of like a puzzle. They put it up and they started to manage it. I mean, what does it mean manage? A pilot follows the order of a airspace controller. A pilot is not steering the plane the way he or she likes. It's the airspace controller that when you are in an approach to an airport, when you are flying somewhere, that gives you directions and tells you where and how and what altitude to fly. So you follow the orders of an airspace controller. That's when you fly in an IFR consideration. So you follow orders. And that makes the whole system safe because there's so many planes around, right? We don't have any mid-air collisions, almost not, right? And the problem with this approach was that we did it nationally, and we have now the big problem of becoming bigger. Like in Europe, we have that problem. In the US, we have one airspace and it's centrally managed. In Europe, we have many airspaces that are decentrally managed, and that's highly inefficient. So Eurocontrol, as a central airspace provider and airspace management company, probably should be in charge of managing European airspace. But as I mentioned before, there are a lot of political, military, security issues that really challenge us. But what we do here is not so efficient. So in Asia, it's the same, that the individual countries have their airspaces. They're a bit bigger, partly, than small countries here in Europe. But if you can learn one thing, then maybe when you go to space, you should have a global airspace, and you should globally manage the airspace. That would be the best.
Yeah, I think that's where many scholars are heading, but it's just a theoretical approach.
Yes.
Yeah, who will lead this kind of activities? Is it a UN organization? Is it OSA? Will be in charge of it? Will it be then at the end our FAA, because they are covering the biggest market and everyone has to follow, like we see it with the Artemis Accords. I hope we can learn more from the aviation sector, I have to say, but it's interesting to get your views on that. When we talk about regulations, and you mentioned it earlier, will regulation limit innovation? I mean, what have you observed with this highly regulated market? Is it?
Very much. There's a very important point. I mean, that's also why I'm in favor of industry self-regulation and creating and taking charge of kind of defining how we want to regulate. The reason is that regulations really can have an impact on innovation. If you look at aviation, we have certification processes. Any tool you want to use in aviation has to be certified, but these processes are expensive, they are timely, and what you do is you don't change. So you build parts into planes that have been there even in Second World War times, maybe some screws, whatever it is, because to certify a new screw that would be lighter, better, whatever, just is no company wants to do it, right? And or you use an iPad. You can use an iPad in a plane to have the runway system on, and I think that's also accepted to a certain extent. But I remember over time in the beginning when that was not accepted because an iPad is not certified. I remember times when you on your iPhone in the plane had the better weather information and forecasts than the systems in the cockpit, right?
Is it still true that they're using fax in the cockpit?
They do have an information system where this is a small paper can come out where they can get information from the ground. For example, if they have to, if they are late and they get information about connecting flights for passengers and passenger information, but otherwise they are connected with the ground service engineering team or help team if there is challenges.
One element in the equation you mentioned before, innovation versus regulation, is of course the commercial effect. I mean, these companies, the industry is not here to do it as a hobby. They want to earn money. They want to maximize profits. And I think that is a reason for regulation. But I think it will help back the self-regulatory aspect because not everyone buys into it just to survive. That's
a bit the challenge of the free economy, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, we have a free market economy, but a free market economy gives us a lot of liberty to develop and do things, but it also asks us to take responsibility. Free liberty and free economy is not coming without taking responsibility, right? So you have freedom, but you have responsibility. And if you just take the freedom part, but not take the responsibility, you will be regulated. The society and, government at a certain point will come in and regulate. That has been the case in many areas. We have seen that so many times. You can look at the financial industry as well. We had that in 2008, right? Some changes and some developments in the financial industry, and then regulation, compliance. And I just wish for the space industry that we're not going that lane, that we are smart enough to take the responsibility, do it in the market ourselves and benefit from it, so we can steer how much kind of impact on innovation and how we can, we can find a way. And if we have the external regulation coming in, the hard regulation, then you cannot find ways. We just have to be compliant, and that's going to be the expensive, slow and innovation kind of killing approach.
Dear listeners, if you hear in the background some noise, or the guys in the hotel are repairing the elevator, so don't matter. So we are not doing anything bad here. Andreas, my last question, and I hope we can end up in a positive note. How do you envision humanity in space in the upcoming decade?
Well, they are like boys' dreams, right? Mm-hmm. And there is more like reality. So I think there is a dream, and the dream is, I want to go to space. I want to see it, and I think it's great what happens and the opportunities there are. Obviously, way too expensive for a person like me, but if you scale it up and you have it more and more, who knows, we may. And what would be even better if we could lift the planes up to space, fly in half an hour to Sydney and land there again, instead of 20 hours flights, half an hour flight. Yeah. Maybe we don't emit CO2 that much in the atmosphere here, but maybe we go out there. The question is, what is the impact there? I don't know, but there is a lot of fantastic ideas about space travel, which I would wish to have, and I would like to join. But then, on the other hand, I'm a bit more conservative and think, well, this is probably just an area of time where we see some trials of some very, let's say, wealthy people, and it's hard to believe that this will be scaling up to the level where the society will use that kind of transport.
That's what they say. That's what they say. Would you go to suborbital or to space?
I would have to sleep over a couple of times, but I think I would.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for hosting us here in this wonderful environment. And
thanks very much, Thorsten.
Hope to hear from you guys soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Before we finish for today, do not miss our next upcoming events. We will take a breather this week, but next week we will rock the floor again, starting on the 21st of March with our Space Café Black Ops, now hosted by Dr. Emma Gatti, who will be talking to Bled and Bowen. On the 22nd of March, we will have our 100th episode, 33 minutes with Josef Aschbacher, discussing the ambitions for the future of Europe in space, specifically the Agenda 2025. On the 23rd of March, we have a very exciting event, one of our white label events, Women Speak Up, the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls. Then, on the 23rd and the 24th of March, do not miss Impulse 22, the Space Outreach Conference. On the 24th of March at 9:30 a.m., we have our next Space Law Breakfast by Stephen Freeland on the themes of cooperation and humanity. And on the 25th of March, we have our next Space Café Germany with our guest presenter Markus Moslechner, who will be talking with Dr. Ernst Pfeiffer. And this will, of course, be in German. And on the 29th of March, we have our next 33 minutes with Laura Ann Edwards. All events are going to be online on Eventbrite. As always, we love to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up for our daily and our bi-weekly newsletters. And if you want to treat yourselves to something special, become a Space Watcher today, or help us in the supporter program. Thank you, Andreas, for the inspiring talk and for being our guest. And thanks again to the entire team behind the scenes for doing that great job week in and week out. I hope that you all stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you for joining us today. I hope to see you all in the next weeks. And in the meantime, don't forget to visit our website and follow us on social media. And don't forget, become a Space Watcher.